Yep.
Okay, so before we get into doing the work that I've assigned to you, there's another issue, another thing that I have to explain to you. We see here that we have 3 cylinders. Notice the first one has the same data as the second one. Notice the data is just the height and the radius. We'll go more into that later, what data they give you and all that. But there are going to be 3 ways of answering questions in this math, okay? We're going to focus mostly on the first way, and we say in terms of pi. That means the answer contains pi. It's there in the answer, and this is generally the mathematical way of doing this kind of stuff, okay, guys? So I'll calculate this in a second, but first let me contrast it with 2 other ways that they can ask you, that they do ask you, and they will ask you when I give you a little test on this down the road. So here the data says the height is 4, the radius is 2. We'll calculate that and put that answer in terms of pi in a second. But first, let's contrast it. Notice that here you need a calculator, and let me write that right away. Maybe it's in terms of pi, but if you think about it, 2.25 squared is too much math for us. It's too much trouble to calculate 225 squared, or if we put it into a fraction, it would turn out to be the same thing. 9 over 4 squared. It ends up being a big number, too much trouble. So we throw in the towel, so to speak, and we're doing math with a calculator here. So in this particular case, I calculate the volume using a calculator by necessity. Because after all, as we've said so many times in our class, we're not going to kill ourselves with numbers like this. We'll use the calculator. And calculators permitted on the test. We agreed that we can use them. So we'll keep that in mind all the time, that when the radius or even the height is a fraction or a decimal, we'll immediately reach for our calculators. That's what they intend. We go over here to this third example, and they want, usually the way that they explain it, or the way that they ask the question, they want it to 100. Whatever the dimensions are, inches or whatever, to 100th of a unit. And when they do this, they want you to either plug in 3.14, or they want you to press the pi button on your calculator. So you guys would be expected to do some of these problems. When I give them to you, you'd be expected to have a calculator, preferably with a pi button, and we'll spend some time doing those problems, but not a lot. And we'll go over rounding again. Sometimes they ask to a 1/10 of a unit, but typically speaking, it's to 100th of a unit, and you'll be expected to use a calculator in a problem like this and a problem like this. Our focus will be on the originals. We'll want to do algebra. We'll want to do math with this, with whole numbers, so we can do algebra and, as I mentioned, the math that we're used to without a calculator. So I'm going to calculate the volume very quickly in these cases. In this case, the volume equals pi r squared h. I plug in the values that I've been given. That is the data, as I explained it to you. And there's the r, which is 2, that's squared, times 4. And the answer is going to be volume equals 16 pi. That's the way we write it. So the mathematician, he or she, they're comfortable with this answer. If I'm a scientist, and I really need to know what this number is, I multiply 16 times 3.14, or the pi button on my calculator. And I can round it to 100th or a 10th or to a unit, whatever the experiment would entail. So there you go, and this is basically where we're going to be. We're going to work these kind of problems so that we don't use a calculator. You'll see what I'm talking about when I do the second problem. I go V equals pi r squared h, thus V equals pi 2.25 squared times 4, we see immediately that this is a big job to do by hand. It's a big job to do with algebra. It's much better to just whip out your calculator, and if they want whatever 2.25 squared is, it would be, again, in terms of pi. You might be asking yourself, well, why would they ask questions like that? The answer is they do. So in this question like this, you keep the pi in the answer, but you need a calculator to come up with the number here, which I said, who knows the perfect squares of 225 or any kind of decimal or fraction they would come up with. So here, I didn't waste my time figuring that out, but you put this in the calculator, multiply it by 4, and the volume would be whatever the calculator said, right next to the pi, because it's in terms of pi. It's important to remember that, and when you start doing problems, to keep that in your mind, this key phrase, in terms of pi. In the third example over here, I again write the formula for the cylinder, and its volume equals pi 2 squared times 4. So we have 16 pi all over again, but they want an answer typically rounded to the 100th, which would be this. And then there you see the pi times the 16, and you just take your calculator out, preferably with the pi button, and multiply pi times 16 and round it to 100th. And we'll do some of those problems together. This is just the basic concepts. So this is what we're interested in to do work. And these kind of problems we'll do, but not so much in the homeworks or the assignments that I'll give you. But you'll be expected to do that, because as I mentioned, I do have a kind of a test that will test your understanding of what I taught you on this. So we're going to end this for now, and we'll come back with compound shapes very shortly. Thank you.